Over 39% of American adults harbor a conviction that we are, currently living in the end times. So, welcome to Reformed Thinking. I really want you to sit with that statistic for a second. I mean, more than a third of the population is walking around right now, grabbing their morning coffee, sitting in traffic, attending meetings, all while carrying this acute, buzzing anxiety that the clock is running out on human history. It's a staggering number, honestly. And when you look at the cultural landscape, you can see the symptoms of that anxiety everywhere. People are looking at the news, they're looking at sociology, global conflicts, and they sense this massive instability. But our author for today's deep dive argues something entirely countercultural. The author suggests that the secular mind actually possesses an intrinsic, intuitive knowledge of an approaching cosmic reckoning. But because the secular worldview rejects divine judgment, it projects those apocalyptic anxieties onto tangible man-made things. Things like climate change, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence, or just total political collapse. People sense the end is coming, but they are misdiagnosing the cause.
Yeah, that is a brilliant place to start because it really frames the entire psychological reality of our present moment. I mean, the author draws a sharp line between a blind evolutionary catastrophe and a divinely orchestrated climax. If you think the world ends because of, say, a nuclear miscalculation or environmental degradation, then the apocalypse is just an accident of human incompetence. But the text we are unpacking today argues that the human heart intuitively knows a final moral judgment is approaching. To suppress that terrifying reality, society obsesses over man-made apocalypses. By focusing on carbon emissions or rogue AI, we trick ourselves into believing that if we just invent better technology or, vote for the right politicians, we can manage the apocalypse. We can stave it off. So the secular world is terrified, but they're terrified of the wrong thing. They're looking at the symptoms rather than the sovereign creator who has ordained the end from the beginning.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. They're trying to control the uncontrollable. So our mission today is to look specifically into two intense, highly detailed theological examinations of the Gospel of Matthew. We are looking at chapter 24, verses 29 through 31, and the sources we are working from are titled The King in the Clouds and the Son of Man Coming in Might and Glory. Our goal is to unpack the author's uncompromising, literal interpretation of the return of Jesus Christ. And I really need to set the tone right out of the gate here. These sources do not treat this biblical passage as poetic allegory. They don't view it as a mild moral lesson about, being a good neighbor or staying positive in tough times. They present this text as a cataclysmic historic certainty. So if you are listening to this right now, I am asking you to take any preconceived notions you might have gathered from pop culture, end times theories, the sci-fi movies, the fictionalized novels about people vanishing on airplanes, and just set them aside. We are preparing for a rigorous verse-by-verse structural analysis of a massive theological event. We are looking at the literal, visible, bodily return of the Lord.
Absolutely. And to properly grasp the weight of this, we have to establish the core theme driving both of these texts. The basic premise is that history is not evolving toward a human-made utopia. We are not, inching our way toward a perfect society through sociological advancement or political reform. The biblical view of history, as presented by the author, is that human civilization is devolving toward a divine climax. The timeline of the world is hurtling toward a catastrophic intersection, a specific moment where eternity crashes violently into the temporal world. So to understand how the author arrives at this conclusion, we have to respect the grammatical and historical method of interpretation. We cannot just lift these verses out of the first century and apply them to a modern news broadcast. We have to look at the precise setting where these words were spoken.
Okay, yeah. That brings us to our first major concept, which is the shadow of the temple and the prophetic setting. So we need to go back in time, back to the year AD 30 or 33. Jesus and his disciples are in Jerusalem, and Jesus has just delivered what is arguably the most blistering denunciation of religious hypocrisy in all of recorded history. In Matthew chapter 23, he unleashes a series of woes upon the scribes and the Pharisees. He calls them whitewashed tombs, blind guides, a brood of vipers, and he concludes that terrifying sermon by pronouncing a devastating judgment upon the nation of Israel, stating, "See, your house is left to you desolate." And right after he drops that theological bomb, they physically walk out of the temple complex and make their way up the Mount of Olives.
Right. And the geographical and historical context here is absolutely vital. You cannot interpret this prophetic discourse accurately without understanding where they are sitting. I mean, the Mount of Olives is not just a random hillside with a scenic view of the Jerusalem skyline. This specific geographical location is drenched in Old Testament prophetic expectation. The prophet Zechariah, in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4, prophesied centuries earlier the Lord's feet would touch down on this precise mountain at the end of the age to fight against the nations. So when Jesus sits down on the Mount of Olives to deliver this teaching, he is sitting on the very fault line of eschatological prophecy. He's speaking directly to his Jewish disciples who are functioning in this moment as the quintessential remnant of Israel. The immediate historical backdrop is the oppressive Roman occupation. The disciples are looking back across the Kidron Valley at these massive, beautiful stones of the Herodian temple complex. And Jesus shatters their worldview by telling them that not one stone will be left upon another. Everything they associate with the worship of God is going to be torn down.
I have to ask a clarifying question here, though, because I think a lot of people get tripped up on this. Let's think about this logically. Jesus is pointing at a physical building in the first century. He is talking to first century fishermen and tax collectors about the literal destruction of that building by the Roman army. How does the author justify leaping forward from a localized first century demolition project to a global cosmic apocalypse thousands of years later? I mean, it feels like a massive hermeneutical jump.
Yeah, it does seem like a jump unless you understand the author's specific theological framework. The author operates from a strict dispensational perspective. So let's define what that means for a listener who might not be familiar with the terminology. Dispensationalism is a theological system that draws a clear, unbridgeable distinction between the nation of Israel and the New Testament church. In this framework, God has distinct plans and distinct promises for both groups. The author argues that when Jesus is speaking on the Mount of Olives, the church is still a mystery that has not yet been fully revealed. Therefore, this specific discourse is primarily Jewish in its orientation. Jesus is answering questions concerning the future of the nation of Israel, the prophesied 70th week of the prophet Daniel, and the establishment of the earthly messianic kingdom. So the author contends that the church is not the primary subject of the tribulation detailed in this chapter. The focus is on Israel and the unbelieving world.
Okay, let me try an analogy to make sure I'm grasping the author's logic, because we know there are differing views on how to handle the Israel and church dynamic. But staying within the author's perspective, think of the AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman general Titus as a localized tremor. It's a devastating, city-destroying earthquake. The temple burns, the stones are torn apart to extract the melted gold, and the tragedy is absolute. But the author views that historical localized tremor as a mere preview, as just a preview, I should say. It is an anticipation of the global earthquake that will shatter the entire world order at the end of the age. So the localized destruction is a historical type, but it cannot contain the massive cosmic language that Jesus uses later in the passage.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it, yeah. Prophetic telescoping is a common feature in biblical literature. You look through the prophetic lens and you see two mountain peaks. The first peak is the destruction by Titus in AD 70, which was a real and horrific historical event. But right behind that peak, looming in the distance, is a much larger cosmic mountain peak, which is the end of the age. The localized setting on a dusty hill in first century Judea acts as the launching pad for the author's structural breakdown of the cosmos itself. The disciples ask a question triggered by the physical temple buildings, and Jesus answers by pulling back the curtain on the consummation of all human history. The immediate provokes the ultimate.
Wow, that is a brilliant way to frame it. The immediate provokes the ultimate. That moves us into the exegetical flow of the passage and the explicit rejection of competing views. So the disciples are reeling from the news that the temple will be destroyed, and they ask a three-part question. They say, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" They link the destruction of the temple with the end of the world. So how does the author block out the structure of Matthew chapter 24 in response to those specific questions?
Well, the author insists that the structural flow of the chapter is the absolute key to unlocking its meaning. Jesus does not give a random collection of scary predictions. He provides a systematic chronological answer. The author breaks it down like this. Verses 4 through 14 describe the general characteristics of the present age, referring to them as the beginning of sorrows. You have wars, rumors of wars, famines, and earthquakes. These are the labor pains of history. Then, verses 15 through 28 zero in on a specific future period of unparalleled horror known as the Great Tribulation, which is triggered by the abomination of desolation. And finally, our focal text for this deep dive, verses 29 through 31, constitutes the absolute climax, the return of the king.
Right. And because the author is so committed to this chronological, futuristic structure, they take aim at some very specific theological interpretations that contradict this timeline. Let's look into the views that the author violently rejects. First up is preterism. For those who do not spend their weekends reading theology textbooks, preterism comes from a Latin word meaning past. It is the claim that all or most of the events in Matthew 24 and even the book of Revelation were entirely fulfilled in the past, specifically in AD 70 during the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. The author absolutely dismantles this view.
They do, yeah. The author uses the massive scale of the cosmic signs to refute the preterist position. And the argument is rooted in simple historical reality. I mean, the text says the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give light, the stars will fall, and the Son of Man will be seen coming on the clouds with might and great glory. If the preterist is correct, and all of this happened in AD 70, then we have a massive problem, because history does not reflect that reality at all. Christ's visible, universally witnessed return in the clouds did not occur when Rome sacked Jerusalem. The elect were not universally gathered from the four winds by angels with a great trumpet blast at that time. Therefore, the preterist view completely fails to account for the explicit grammar and the universal scope of the text. To make preterism work, you have to turn everything into a metaphor.
Which leads right into the author's second target, which is amillennialism, specifically within certain branches of covenant theology. Now, some listeners might lean amillennial, viewing the thousand-year reign as a present spiritual reality. But the author pushes back hard against this, arguing that this view flattens the eschatological timeline into a continuous, spiritualized present, and that basically robs the text of its literal futuristic impact.
Yeah, the author's critique here is focused on the method of interpretation. When you encounter words like the sun darkening or the stars falling, the amillennial approach often spiritualizes that language. It treats those descriptions as apocalyptic poetry, representing the rise and fall of nations, or, the ongoing spiritual victory of the church throughout history. The author argues that this approach allegorizes the physical return of the Lord into a metaphor, and by doing so, it robs the believer of the imminent, literal expectation of Christ's physical intervention. The author demands a futuristic chronological sequence based on the plain reading of the text. This is not an allegory of spiritual enlightenment. It is a literal, earth-shattering intervention where the physical universe is dismantled.
I'm picturing the author's view of history as a highly orchestrated, irreversible countdown sequence. It is not a repeating cycle of seasons. It is not a metaphorical story about good eventually winning over evil in the hearts of men. It is a precise, divine countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, and when that countdown hits 0, there is a visible, undeniable physical arrival that interrupts the space-time continuum. With that timeline defended, let's analyze the very first tick of that final countdown, which is the collapse of creation. We are looking at verse 29. The conceptual translation reads, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken."
So we really must zero in on the Greek grammar here, because the author uses it to anchor the entire chronological argument. The text begins with the adverb euthesis, which translates to immediately. This is a precise chronological marker. It firmly anchors the ensuing cosmic events to the immediate cessation of the unparalleled horrors described in the preceding verses. There is no gap. There is no long, drawn-out metaphorical fulfillment spanning centuries. The moment the tribulation ends, the universe collapses. Furthermore, the word used for tribulation is thlipsis. This is not a general word for having a hard time. It denotes a pressing, crushing physical pressure. In the context of the Olivet discourse, it is specifically tied to the eschatological time of Jacob's trouble, which is an era of global terror unlike anything the world has ever seen.
Wow. The theological weight of this cosmic upheaval is staggering when you break down the mechanics of what the author is describing. The author explains this moment as the total withdrawal of common grace. Let's pause and define common grace for you listening. It is the theological concept that God, in his goodness, restrains the full measure of human evil and sustains the natural world so that life can flourish. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. He holds the atoms together. The author states that creation obeys God as a herald. The universe is sustained by the word of his power. So when that sustaining hand of common grace is withdrawn in an act of final judgment, the physical laws of gravity, light, and motion simply collapse. The universe falls apart because the one holding it together lets go.
Precisely. It is the absolute dismantling of the physical fabric of reality. We are looking at a compound sentence consisting of 4 devastating indicative verbs. The sun is darkened, the moon withholds light, stars fall, heavenly powers are shaken. This signifies the onset of unmitigated divine wrath. The author's point is that the universe is not sustained by natural laws alone, operating independently of a creator. Gravity is not autonomous. Light is not autonomous. They are upheld continually by the decree of the Son of God. When he removes that sustaining grace, creation itself collapses in terror. It is the uncreation of the world.
But I have to ask, why target the sun, the moon, and the stars specifically? If you are going to dismantle the world, why not start with massive earthquakes swallowing continents or, I don't know, the oceans boiling away? Well, the author points out something beautiful and terrifying about the Genesis creation account. These specific celestial bodies were set in the firmament on the fourth day of creation to govern time. They are the ultimate timekeepers. They establish days, seasons, and years. By destroying them first, God dismantles human arrogance and the illusion of a fixed, self-sustaining universe.
What is fascinating here is how Jesus deliberately echoes the prophetic language of the Old Testament. He is drawing directly from Isaiah chapter 13 and Joel chapter 2. The author points out that Jesus is utilizing the exact phraseology from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, to demonstrate that he is the fulfillment of these ancient oracles. When Isaiah prophesied the destruction of Babylon, he used similar cosmic language to describe the fall of an empire. But Jesus takes that language and applies it to the entire globe. This disruption is not a local eclipse. It is not a metaphorical way of saying a king has lost his throne. It is the literal shaking of the physical heavens. The very things humans look to for stability are eradicated.
Think about how modern secular thought treats the universe. We treat it as a closed, predictable, mechanical system. We set our atomic clocks by it. We calculate the exact trajectory of planets. We predict solar eclipses centuries in advance, down to the minute. The author's interpretation shatters this closed system thinking, showing that the physical heavens are entirely fragile and contingent on a divine decree. The universe is not the ultimate reality. The Creator is the ultimate reality.
Yeah, this exposes the utter folly of placing our confidence in the created order. The author argues a brilliant psychological point here. Men who will not tremble at sermons will tremble when the sky itself becomes a herald of the king. The secular world confidently asserts that all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. But Christ says the powers of heaven will be shaken. This total suffocating darkness of the cosmos sets the stage for the most terrifying illumination in human history.
Oh, wow. That gives me chills. The narrative shifts to verse 30, and the imagery is overwhelming. The sign of the Son of Man appears, all the tribes of the earth mourn, and he is seen coming on the clouds with absolute might and great glory. Let's break down this concept of the sign. The Greek word is semeion. For centuries, people have speculated about what the sign could be, right?
Yes, they have. And the author specifically rejects the wild speculations that arose in the early church regarding this sign. Some patristic writers, like Chrysostom, speculated that a giant luminous cross would appear in the sky, stretching from the east to the west. The author dismisses that entirely. A careful study of extra-biblical Greek literature and the New Testament usage reveals that a semeion points to a divine reality. The author defines the sign not as an object, but as the unbridled visible explosion of the Shekinah glory of Christ. Think about the Shekinah glory in the Old Testament, the blinding pillar of fire that led the Israelites, the glory that filled the Holy of Holies. The sign is that blinding, unapproachable light tearing through the unnatural pitch-black darkness of the collapsed cosmos. The sign is the glory of the King himself.
That is incredible. And then we see the reaction of the earth. The text says all the tribes of the earth mourn. The Greek verb used here is koptu. It does not mean shedding a quiet tear. It means mourning by physically striking the breast. It is a visceral, physical manifestation of intense, inconsolable grief.
That verb is highly significant when you trace it back to its roots. The author connects koptu directly to Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. It is the exact word used in the Septuagint translation of that Old Testament passage, which says, "They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child." By using this specific word, Jesus is directly connecting the returning Son of Man to the pierced Jehovah of the Old Testament. This mourning is not tears of joy. It is not tears of relief that the suffering is over. This is the agonizing, hopeless terror of a reprobate world realizing that all their secular philosophies, their political allegiances, and their false religions have completely failed them.
It's the terror of total exposure. I mean, the people mourning are the ones who rejected, ignored, or mocked him. They suddenly realize that the one they thought was a myth or just a good moral teacher is actually the absolute Lord of reality. Now let's talk about the specific vehicle of his return. The text says he is coming upon the clouds. The Greek phrase is erchomenon epiton nephlon.
Right, and this is a direct, undeniable extraction from Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. In that vision, Daniel sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, approaching the Ancient of Days to receive an everlasting kingdom. By utilizing this specific phrase, Jesus is making an explicit claim to absolute deity and sovereign authority. The grammar insists on a literal, visible, bodily descent. He's not just a human representative. He's the exalted messianic figure invested with everlasting dominion. Throughout the Old Testament, clouds are the vehicle of divine majesty. God led the Israelites in a cloud. He descended on Mount Sinai in a thick cloud. The clouds signify the presence of God.
And the author uses this specific grammatical structure to launch a fierce theological condemnation of the Jehovah's Witness doctrine. That religious group posits an invisible spiritual return of Christ that supposedly happens secretly in the year 1914. The author uses the Greek participle paired with the preposition epi to completely dismantle this claim. The grammar implies a literal, visible, bodily descent resting upon the clouds. It is an event that every eye will see. It cannot be hidden. It cannot be invisible. You do not have an invisible explosion of Shekinah glory.
No, you certainly don't. The author labels such cultic twisting of Scripture as damnable heresy. The motive behind the 1914 doctrine is clear. When the predicted visible return did not happen, they had to spiritualize the event to save face. But the biblical text leaves no room for a secret return. The arrival is public, glorious, and unavoidable. The crucified Nazarene is revealed as the cosmic king. But what is crucial to notice is the sequence of events. The king has arrived in blinding glory. The physical universe is unraveling. The reprobate world is striking their breasts in terror. But right in the middle of this catastrophic judgment, the text immediately pivots to an action of sovereign rescue.
Yeah, which brings us to verse 31, the sovereign summons. The king sends his angels with a great trumpet sound to gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Let's unpack the imagery of the trumpet first. The Greek word is salpix.
The salpix carries immense redemptive historical weight. The author links this to ancient Near Eastern alarms of war, but more importantly to the gathering of the assembly of Israel. In Numbers chapter 10, God commands the blowing of silver trumpets to summon the congregation. It also references the great trumpet of Isaiah chapter 27, verse 13, where the trumpet is blown to gather the outcasts of Israel who are perishing in Assyria and Egypt. The verb used for sending the angels highlights royal command and heavenly agency. The angels act as the direct servants of the king, executing his saving purpose across the globe.
And the targets of this gathering are the elect, from the Greek word eklektos. Now, as Reformed Christians, we understand the weight of this word. The author uses this specific term to vehemently reject Arminian synergism. So let's pause and define Arminian synergism for the listener. Synergism is the theological belief that salvation involves some form of cooperation between divine grace and human free will. It suggests that God provides the opportunity, but man must supply the decisive choice. The author looks at this text and says, absolutely not. God is not blowing a trumpet and waiting for human permission. He is not setting up a scenario and hoping people decide to gather themselves. This is an irresistible sovereign summons.
Yeah, the author points out that the possessive nature of the phrase is key here. They are his elect. God sovereignly summons those whom he foreknew and predestined before the foundation of the world. The Greek syntax reveals a divine, irresistible calling. The gathering is global, it is complete, and it is entirely certain. Not a single one of Christ's sheep remains forgotten or left behind. The text demonstrates that Christ's saving purpose is effectual. It reaches from one end of heaven to the other. Monergism, the belief that God alone acts to save, is vividly displayed here. The king commands, the angels gather, and the elect are secured.
But wait, I have a massive structural question here. Who exactly is being gathered in this specific moment if the author believes the church is already gone? You mentioned earlier that the author holds a dispensational, pre-tribulational view. If the church was raptured before the 7 years of tribulation began, who is left on earth to be gathered by these angels?
That's a great question, and it requires us to synthesize the author's dispensational framework. The author argues that the church, the bride of Christ, composed of Jews and Gentiles united in the current age, was raptured before the tribulation darkness fell. The author bases this on passages like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Therefore, the elect that the angels are gathering in Matthew 24 are not the church. They are primarily the preserved Jewish remnant and the massive number of Gentiles who came to saving faith during the tribulation period. God is fulfilling his old covenant promises. He promised to gather scattered Israel back to their ancestral land for the establishment of the earthly millennial kingdom. And this angelic gathering is the execution of that specific promise.
Okay, I picture this as an ultimate divine search and rescue mission. It spans the entire globe and is completely unaffected by human limitations like distance, obscurity, or previous death. It doesn't matter if a tribulation believer was scattered by intense persecution, hidden in a cave in the mountains, or buried in an unmarked mass grave. When the trumpet sounds, the angels are dispatched, and the rescue is flawlessly executed. There is zero margin of error in divine election.
None whatsoever. This reality provides immense psychological and spiritual comfort to the afflicted. The author states a beautiful principle here. The weakest believer united to Christ is safer than the strongest empire opposed to him. The promise of the gathering rests not on the believer's grip upon Christ. Our grip is weak, we fail. The promise rests entirely on Christ's sovereign grip upon the believer. The king loses none of his subjects.
That is so encouraging. Now, we are going to look at the application side of this text. The author does not just analyze the Greek grammar and historical setting in a vacuum. They apply this text to the modern world with a blistering critique of cultural and religious movements. And I want to reiterate for you listening, we are examining the author's specific theological argument here, observing how a literal reading of Matthew 24 inevitably collides with modern ideologies. We should point out we're just reporting what the author claims here. We're not taking a stance on these political or social movements. So let's look into the specific ideological battlegrounds the author targets based on this passage.
The first major target is seeker-sensitive pragmatism within the modern church. The author claims this movement effectively emasculates the pulpit. The seeker-sensitive model relies on market research, attempting to remove anything offensive or frightening from the church service to appease secular consumers. The author argues that churches have traded the solemn gravity of the biblical text for shallow storytelling, therapeutic self-help, and entertainment. By avoiding the terrifying reality of the coming king and the impending cosmic judgment, the author asserts that this pragmatism leaves congregations completely unprepared for the consummation of history. If the sky is going to fall, giving a sermon on 5 steps to better time management is theological malpractice.
Yeah, another major target is the prosperity gospel. The author is unsparing here, arguing that these false promises will literally burn like chaff in the fire of his presence. The text dismisses the prosperity gospel as a deceitful obsession with finding one's best life now. Think about the sheer absurdity of it. Using Jesus as a transactional means to acquire earthly wealth, fancy cars, or career success completely contradicts the reality of a universe destined for physical collapse. If the physical elements of the earth are going to be dissolved and the king is returning in absolute judgment, then storing up treasures on earth is the definition of insanity.
Absolutely. The author also takes rigorous aim at liberal theology. The text rejects the historical reduction of Jesus to a gentle moral teacher, a community organizer, or a mascot for modern social agendas. Liberalism, according to the author, often treats biblical prophecy as mere religious imagination. They view it as the early Christian community reflecting on their struggles and inventing apocalyptic stories to cope. This completely denies the supernatural authority of the biblical text. The author argues that the visible bodily return of Christ in might and glory invalidates any theology that attempts to strip him of his divine sovereignty. He's not coming back to debate ethics, he is coming back to rule.
Right.
And then the author explicitly identifies Marxist eschatology and critical race theory, along with broader secular social justice crusades, as worldly ideologies attempting to usurp the divine narrative. Again, the text argues that these movements attempt to build a kingdom without the king. The author's position is that focusing on human-managed political or social utopias, believing we can eradicate all evil through legislation or social restructuring, distracts the church from its true heavenly gaze. We cannot engineer the new heavens and the new earth.
Yeah, if we synthesize the author's overarching thesis in this section, it is this. Any theological or social movement that treats human history as a human-managed project is fundamentally anti-biblical. The author insists that the kingdom of God is not secured by cultural influence. It is not secured by gaining political power or utilizing advanced human technique. The kingdom belongs exclusively to the returning Christ. By stripping away these modern distractions and exposing the futility of human utopias, the author forces the reader to look solely at the person of Christ and his impending arrival. That brings us to what the author considers the absolute core of the passage, which is the Christological apex. This entire text in Matthew 24 is not just a timetable of scary events meant to satisfy our curiosity about the future. It is the ultimate vindication of the Son of God. The author highlights the hypostatic union. That is a massive theological term, so let's break it down. The hypostatic union refers to the reality of Jesus bearing a true human nature while simultaneously wielding unrestricted divine authority. He is one person with 2 distinct natures, fully God and fully man.
Right, and the text brilliantly breaks down how Christ fulfills 3 distinct offices in this passage, offices that correspond directly to his nature: prophet, priest, and king. First, as prophet, he declares the future with absolute sovereign certainty. When Jesus speaks on the Mount of Olives, he is not guessing. He is not offering a probability model. He is issuing covenantal revelation. His prophetic word stands because he is truth incarnate. As the author notes, this absolute certainty invalidates liberal theories that treat these words as community reflection. The prophet speaks reality into existence.
The second office is priest, and the author makes a connection here that is just phenomenal. The gathering of the elect in verse 31 presupposes redemption. Think about it. The king can only gather these people from the four winds because the priest has already purchased them with his own blood. The elect are not gathered because they survived the tribulation by their own moral merit or because they hid in the best bunkers. They are gathered because they were reconciled to God by the high priestly sacrifice of Christ. The one who comes in blinding glory is the exact same one who first came in deep humility to bear the wrath of God on their behalf.
That's beautifully said. And finally, as king, the cross is vindicated by the crown. The pattern of humiliation and exaltation is complete. In his first coming, he was mocked, judged by sinful men, beaten, and crowned with thorns. He allowed himself to be subjected to the temporal authorities of Rome and the religious corruptions of Jerusalem. But in his second coming, he is unveiled as the sovereign Lord of the cosmos. He commands angelic armies. He bends the physical elements of the universe to his will. The crucified Nazarene is revealed as the cosmic king, and the nations mourn because his undeniable majesty exposes their lifelong rebellion.
I really want you to visualize this massive reversal. The author paints a staggering picture of this contrast. Think about the hands that were nailed to the wood on the cross at Calvary. The author points out that those are the exact same hands that will casually extinguish the stars in the sky. The one who stood silent and bloody before Pilate is the one whose arrival completely silences the entire universe. The reversal of power is absolute.
That visceral imagery captures the essence of the author's pastoral intentions, which leads us to how the author applies this text. The application is not just academic. It is intensely practical, both to the original first-century audience who were facing horrific martyrdom under the Roman Empire and to the reader today. The application is dual in nature. It provides sheer terror for the unbeliever and immense grounding comfort for the believer.
Let's talk about the warning presented to the unbeliever. The author states there is no middle ground. You cannot remain neutral regarding the king in the clouds. The text demands immediate repentance. It urges sinners to abandon their reliance on secular philosophies, their trust in wealth, and their belief in human goodness, and to flee to the cross. The author uses a phrase that summarizes the entire gospel beautifully. The only shelter from the king in the clouds is the blood of the king on the tree. If someone is outside the covenant of grace, trusting in their own self-righteousness or the false security of the modern world, they will be among those who strike their breasts and mourn in absolute terror when the sky falls.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. But for the believer, the application is massive comfort. But we must understand that this comfort comes with a strict, unyielding demand for personal holiness. The believer is called to a complete detachment from the temporal world. The logic is airtight. If the physical universe is scheduled for absolute destruction by divine decree, then placing our hope in stock portfolios, career advancement, or earthly political institutions is sheer foolishness. It is like rearranging the deck chairs on a sinking ship. The author insists that this eschatological hope should not produce spiritual laziness. We are not supposed to quit our jobs and stare at the sky. Nor should it produce speculative paralysis where we spend all our time trying to decode hidden dates. Instead, the knowledge of the end should produce rigorous obedience and watchful endurance.
The author brings in a quote from the great Reformed preacher Charles Spurgeon to drive this home. Spurgeon said, "He who came once in shame will come again in glory. He who was the despised and rejected of men will be the universally acknowledged Lord of all." The cross was not a defeat or an accident of history. It was the ordained, deliberate path by which the king secured his people before returning to judge his enemies.
Right, and so the text teaches us how to wait. We are to wait not as date setters obsessed with speculative timelines. We're not to wait as skeptics who doubt his return because the centuries keep passing. We are to wait as faithful servants whose master has spoken an unbreakable word. The knowledge of the end is given specifically to produce watchfulness, moral purity, and active obedience in the present moment. We live today in light of that final day.
Let's do a quick recap of the massive progression we have covered in this deep dive. We started with the terrifying physical collapse of the universe, the extinguishing of the sun, moon, and stars as common grace is withdrawn. We moved to the undeniable, terrifying, visible arrival of the sovereign king in the clouds, bringing the reprobate world to its knees in mourning. And we ended with the unstoppable, gracious gathering of his chosen people from the four winds by the angelic host. It is a stunning progression from cosmic judgment to divine rescue.
It really is. It is a monumental declaration of reality. Human history is ruled by God, it will be judged by God, and it is moving irreversibly toward the public revelation of the Son. The text demands that we evaluate where we place our trust and how we view the unfolding of global events. We are not victims of a random universe. We are subjects of an approaching king.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, lingering question to turn over in your mind as you go about the rest of your day. We have talked extensively about the author's view that the physical ground you stand on, the stars in the night sky, and the massive political and economic structures of this era are all scheduled for demolition. They are temporary scaffolding meant to be torn down to make way for a single royal arrival. If you truly internalize that concept, if you believe that the countdown is ticking, how does that alter the way you invest your time, your anxieties, and your hope tomorrow morning? Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking.